Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Cabin Fever. This is the 2002 movie because I know this movie had gotten remade. So, this is the original one. I could say, really, like, between the original and the remake, both of these movies are heavily similar. There's not a drastic difference between the remakes and the original. And so, really, I think, if anything, possibly in this Cabin Fever version, I think that this movie is a little bit more raunchier, but I think that this movie is also a little bit more cringe than the remake movie. Like, the remake film is to, like, seemingly just try to be like an actual movie, like, for the most point, where certain roles that weren't important in this original film are more important in the remake. Like, we end up having the police officer character in the remake, who seems to have a much more important role than the officer character that's kind of being put into this film. So, because I finally was able to actually watch this and see this for the first time. So, yeah, so first time watching, everybody, I gotta have that goofy gimmick like everyone else weirdly has for whatever reason. No offense to anybody that does that, like, but still, like, I will never put that on a YouTube channel, video, like, but anyways, because it shouldn't matter when you watch it as long as you get to it. So where can you get to this film? Well, one, if you've conveniently already had an app called Peacock, then by golly, you can go and see this movie and be able to probably see Halloween Kills and stuff like that for absolutely free. If you don't have Peacock, I'll let you know a convenient way to see this for free without ending up having to do all this rigmarole of going into an app specifically. I have been using fairly reliable apps like Fox HD Movies. If you go into Google Play, you can go out of your way to find this app because there, in fact, it'll say Fox HD Movies on the logo, but the title will be something different. And so you can find this app there, and dare say you can be able to watch this movie and probably any other Cabin Fever films seemingly for free, as long as there's like some kind of easy link when you go through like the 720s or the 1080s or whichever, and find the right app that works for you or your device, and you should be able to watch any of these movies. Or you can probably go into any number of apps that I've been using over time. TV Crush. You could possibly go into apps like Letter C Movies if you go into a Google search. Or you can also go into like Yes Movies and Shows. You can go into that by going into a Google search and finding those. Because it won't be easy for you to find in a Google Play Store. But anyways, so how did I feel about this film? So kind of a cringy film, but like it makes up for it because it seems that there's quite a bit more like scenes where we are to have people go at it, or really just risque like scenes that eventually might appeal to somebody. But then there's also some moments where there is to also be gross out things because that's what this movie is to provide. Really, there is to be this skin rash thing that's going on between all these characters, where slowly but surely we end up starting to see characters doing a number of things that might not be a thing that people might want to go to a film and see. So these people eventually have skin rashes where eventually it seems that their skin is to start to become bloody. There are at points in time where people are to be barfing up blood. So that might not appeal to anybody. And there are some moments where it seems that eventually, like more and more, there's to be just some like gross out moments at some point in time in this film. But with that said, like interestingly enough, this movie also becomes like a where is Eli Roth in this movie, because it seems like Eli Roth, the director of this film, plays multiple characters in this film for whatever reason. Like, I don't know why. Like, I wonder if Eli Roth just did that on his own purpose, or maybe it was just like, well, like we just didn't have these people, and I just decided to, like, well, how about I just be this role? How do I just be this role? So that way we could save some money on this film. Maybe that's what his decision was, to just continue to just keep popping in throughout this whole entire film. Like, I had spotted Eli Roth. I think Eli Roth had been in this movie like 3 times, but maybe he might have been in this movie 4 times, or maybe more than that, because there might have been a spot where I just didn't quickly notice him. Um, but yeah, so let me know how many times you had spotted Eli Roth in this movie. So with that said, I would say that this movie is a solid, okay film, just because one, it unleashes like a paranoia in me of just being like worried about, like, oh my god, yeah, like what am I washing my hands with? Because I'm washing my hands with water from a sink where I'm like, ugh, like it just unleashes paranoia, and there's bits and pieces of cringe in this film. But like, with that also said, considering I've seen the remake, like I knew what I was getting into, and I had like some fun with this film, even though again it unleashes paranoia and just uh like well, which version of this movie would I probably say would be something to check out? Well, if you probably want raunchiness, I would probably check out this original version. Um, More than likely, if you want to like kind of like, I would probably like, because I watched the remake and then I watched this one, and I think that would probably be the best way to approach this, to maybe go into the remake and then eventually go and watch the original, but people may feel differently. Um, so yeah, so with that said, because honestly, it probably doesn't really matter. People could say there isn't much of any difference, so what difference does it make which version you watch? So, but with that said, let's go out of our way to go into that double five time territory, talk about this film, and go on to eventually just say, hey, we're done. So it is spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, well, I guess I didn't even tee this movie up. So eventually we have a group who decide to go into cabin thing. And it's kind of funny. I've been doing a lot of cabin movies. Like, I don't know why it just ended up being that way. Where eventually it's like, oh yeah, like let's do a lot of movies that seem just like Cabin in the Woods, but eventually this is to have like a skin disease, so it's not like exactly Cabin in the Woods, the Chris Hemsworth movie. Um, but yeah, so we end up having a group of people that want to go off to this cabin to really either finally cement a relationship between two people, or eventually have uh, two people like Marcy and Jeff trying to eventually just take their whole time being at this cabin to probably just sleep with one another, or to eventually play around with one another without having the obligation of like needing anybody to just like be like, come on guys, knock it off. Like, because no, they're gonna heavily go at it. So we end up also having this guy who is to be Bert, who ends up going out in the forest to go and just kind of randomly shoot at squirrels or do some kind of goofy thing to just kind of kill time and just kind of do something fun at this cabin. And so eventually he stumbles onto a homeless man, where eventually he ends up regretting this, because eventually the homeless man is to eventually have this skin sickness, or this skin irritation or whatever. And so Bert eventually is to run off to eventually have this homeless man eventually find this cabin and eventually try and steal these people's car, to where they are now having to forcibly like have this guy get away from this vehicle and stop him from trying to steal this car. But uh, if he doesn't steal the car, he basically ends up spray painting it with blood, or spray hair spraying it with blood, spray painting it. There we go, with blood. And so they're like, like, dude, we have to like freaking clean this car because it's the only car we have, sadly enough. So, like, that's a whole thing. People always make the mistake of having one car wherever, like, it's always the horror movie where there's always one car, and but even when you have like multiple cars or whatever, usually it ends up being that the monster ends up tearing up parts from it, and so it doesn't really matter how many cars that you have at some point. But still, like, there's certain situations where it'd just be nice to have like more than one car, because usually like stuff goes horribly awry with one car, and then you're just left out the middle of nowhere with nowhere to go but walk through whatever part of forest or whatever. So, anyways, um, so eventually they go and they start beating the crap out of this homeless guy to eventually scare him off. And slowly but surely, this homeless person is to eventually land himself body first into this source of water, which they end up finding out is to, of course, be in or coming from their faucets, their sinks, their whatevers. And so all of a sudden, because this homeless man decided to go into a swim and die, now all of a sudden we end up having to start having people infected because they drank this water. And so now it becomes like a movie where it's just to see like who is to drink a thing of water or not. I have some like thunder and lightning and rain and stuff going on in this recording, so if you hear any kind of thunderous noises, that's from what that is. So, like, I feel like I have to quickly say that, just like, hey, sorry about the weather. So then eventually it turns into who is going to get sick and who is eventually going to make a mistake of eventually touching anybody, or eventually having someone just spray blood all over their face, basically. So yeah, like, it also gets interesting where you are to slowly but surely start to see people get ill, sick, or whatever. And so yeah, so, and also we end up getting the interesting scene where eventually Darcy is to just tell Paul, it's like, well, hey, like, I think that we're probably going to die soon, so like we should just F like crazy, because we're probably going to die. Like, that is a really interesting scene. Because like very rarely do you ever get that in a horror film where people are like, well, we're probably going to die soon, so we might as well just like F it, and or F, and then eventually, like, because we're gonna die anyways. Because I've seen movies like weirdly like Dracula 3000, where I think the two couple were to that ended in that movie were just like, well, I guess we should probably just do it because we're probably gonna die anyways. But yeah, so pushing on, so eventually it just comes down to who's going to be left alive at the end of all this, and who's going to be so happy or proud that they ended up living the longest. So, with that said, let's just go into that double five time territory. Let's just go and spoil this movie, because at the end of the day, it's time to say spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil this movie. So yeah, so I kind of like I'm gonna go back to the teeing up version, but there's gonna be like an extended cut of that for the most point, where I just kind of like just dropped where I was going with at that point. So let's go back. So very beginning of the movie, we have this homeless guy who is to have this dog with him who had died, And so this homeless man is kind of poking at this dog. Eventually, he's going to grab its legs to just kind of like grab the body to see what's going on with this dog. To eventually find out that this dog's body has just kind of been ripped in half by this skin disease. So I'm like, ah. But we end up also having certain dogs also in here that just become very ravenous and start like basically chewing into people and killing them, sadly. So that's sad. So eventually, that homeless man, since touching his dog, ends up getting this illness. And so now let's go into, of course, this group of people all decide to go to this cabin. And so we have Paul, who ends up going and sitting next to this kid because he seems all good and nice until this kid ends up grabbing Paul's arm and biting it. And so we end up having Jeff telling this kid's father that, like, hey, like, your kid, like, biting my friend, like, my friend could easily sue you for, like, having this kid just being out here, realizing how dangerous he is. And so, uh, and I'm assuming this kid's father is to be Henry. Oh no, wait, that's probably the hermit. Um, okay, it doesn't really look like it says who this person is, or says clearly. Let me know in the comments below who the character's name is. Anyways, pushing on because I don't have that kind of time. Anyways, uh, yeah, I don't see him on IMDb. Anyways, so the group ends up pushing on to go to their cabin, and so immediately we have both Marcy and Jeff who start to go at it, and both Karen and Paul are wanting to go to this lake to go and just kind of swim together. And Paul is to let Jeff and Darcy know, hey, we're going out in the pool. And basically, like, both of them are naked at this point, just going at it. And so Jeff is just kind of mad at Paul because of his sea blocking that he's basically doing right now, where it's like, hey, buddy, you want to leave me alone? So Bert ends up going off, and he is to go and just shoot squirrels because he likes to do that. So Bert ends up going and starting to shoot some squirrels, but then eventually he finds this diseased, skin irritated homeless man. And so this guy has to mention, like, hey man, I'm sick. And Bert's like, get away from me, like, don't get closer to me, like, there's something wrong with you, and just don't get closer. Bert starts firing this gun at this guy, and so we have the homeless man who is to basically, like, I think they mostly just call him the hermit in this movie, so I guess we can call him that. Because we consistently have Jeff who calls him Hermit. So Hermit ends up because I know hermit, like, kind of means homeless person, because I had just seen the dead don't die, and they end up calling him, like, hermit, the one guy, the homeless guy, hermit, in that movie too. So so eventually Bert is to tell this guy, yeah, we're gonna get help for you, and then he never comes back. So eventually later on, we end up having everybody go and sit together at this campfire, where eventually Paul is to mention this this story that I guess that he had from his part of town, where Paul was to want to go to the bowling alley one day, and his dad was to say that the bowling alley was closed. And so Paul ended up finding out later that supposedly the reason why this bowling alley was closed was because there was to be this one guy who I guess took a bunch of people in this bowling alley and tied them all up into these chairs into a circle, and then eventually took this ball peen hammer and just started like bashing all these people to death. Then weirdly enough started taking certain like pieces of them and using their like body parts to try and bowl. Like I guess to eventually try like use people's heads as like bowling balls and all kinds of weird stuff. Whereas supposedly Eli Roth's character, who's to be this guy who's to be giving these people their shoes, and he always smiles weirdly. It seems that the ball peen hammer killer was to have eventually took Eli Roth's character's head, and evidently the guy's head ended up getting stuck in the ball machine, and so eventually they ended up finding the guy's head into the ball machine, still smiling supposedly. And so they're like, okay, right, like that story is really real. And Paul's like, hey man, like that's what I heard. So eventually that seems to be the only like real scary story that they could put together. So all of a sudden we end up having Eli Roth again showing up as this stoner who has this like goatee now, this like soul patch of a goatee. And so Eli Roth is to say like, hey man, like, could you use one more at your like campfire there? Like your campfire looks so like, he ends up saying like some kind of uh, like Zen kind of words, uh, like your fire is so powerful or something like that, or some weird goofy word. And so like at first, so he's like, hey man, like, would you like a +1? And they're like, oh no, like, hey man, like, this is a private fire. And so Eli Roth's character, or Eli's character, is just like, well, man, that's too bad because I have all this weed that I can just be smoking right now. And they're like, oh yeah, hey, yeah, bring over that weed. And they're like, he's like, oh yeah, that's what I thought. so, so Eli and his dog go over there, and so they end up smoking up this weed, and so eventually the guy has to mention that he's some like extreme sports guy, and they're like, oh hey, wow, that's interesting. And so eventually the guy ends up going off and says that he'll come back, and they're like, yeah man, bring back that weed and we can smoke more of that weed. So eventually they all go back to the cabin, and so all of a sudden there's a knock at the door, and they naturally assume that it's probably the stoner Eli Roth character. But they end up finding out that it's the hermit character instead, and he is to be still diseased, skin ridden. And so this, of course, guy's like, can you help me? And they're like, yeah, we don't trust this guy. So Bert is to immediately like slam the door, like, hey man, like I don't want him in our house. I don't want him like freaking, I don't want to get as sick as this guy is. So like we're just gonna leave him out there and force him to eventually like take care of his own self. And so there's a lot of kind of consensus of what they want to do with this guy. And so this guy just decides that he's just gonna go and just hop into these people's car and just try to either hotwire it or something. And so all of a sudden the group realizes that, and so all of them end up starting to get these weapons. Like Paul ends up getting this baseball bat, Bert ends up getting his gun out, and I think Jeff ends up getting this like fireplace poker or something like that. So they end up all going out there, and so the hermit ends up going and spray painting this like just truck with blood. And so he's just like blah blah, freaking everywhere. Like he's covering the whole windshield with blood. Like this whole car is filled with blood. Everywhere you look, blood everywhere in this vehicle. So Jeff goes in there first and starts to like poke the back of this seat to just kind of scare this guy out of this car, but that's not working. Bert is to eventually fire the gun to get this guy out of there, and that's not working. Uh, I think eventually this homeless man finally gets out of this car, and so Paul takes a swing at him, and so eventually what ends up really happening is that the girls end up starting to like uh, spray some kind of like hairspray in this guy's face, and like they try to just kind of scare him, and so Paul ends up having this torch where he just lights this homeless man on fire, and so this guy runs off to eventually just dump himself into this lake that coincidentally is otherwise tied to these people's faucets and sinks and whatever. So eventually they're like, "Oh, thank God that that's over," but still they eventually have to go and clean this car afterwards. Because like, dude, this car is freaking totaled. So eventually they start throwing blame of who messed up Jeff's car the most, and really it's just like everyone is really just to blame. So eventually we have Paul and Bert trying to clean this car, but really they still need a mechanic to like fix the car. So eventually Paul is at some point to bump into this one police officer called Winston, and so Paul is like, well, hey man, like we didn't have a phone on us. We were gonna try and like get somewhere with somebody. Or no, wait, they did have a phone on them, but I don't think they had any bars. So eventually they're like, hey man, we didn't have a landline here, and so we couldn't call anyone. And so Winston is like, well, yeah, everybody weirdly just has radios here, and evidently that's what Winston uses. So eventually they file the report of the homeless man, and eventually we just have Winston who's weirdly just like, hey, yeah, you're the party guys, huh? You just love to party, huh? Like, yeah, I know all the parties that are around this place. Like, yeah, maybe you should come with us sometime, and like come with me sometime. We can go and party. And like, I'm just like, and this is a police officer that is just riding around on his bike. I'm like, okay, sure. But Winston arrives because supposedly he's been hearing some noise complaints or just certain kind of complaints of certain kinds. So, anyways, so what ends up happening is both Jeff and Bert decide to walk to a stretch of road to where they eventually find some lady who is to be, I guess, a kind of a pig slaughterer, I guess. And so Bert and Jeff go to this home eventually to find this woman cutting these pigs open, and this woman is to be just so frustrated because supposedly her pigs are just not in the right condition that they should be in. So I was trying to look to see if there was a name that I could find anywhere for this woman, and she's like, yeah, I can't sell these pigs. They've all rotted out. There's something wrong with them. So, as we say this, as this girl is just kind of like covered with blood on her face or on her chest. And uh, so the guys are just like, well, hey, like, if we could just please just like use your phone or radio or something to eventually just call a mechanic, like, we would be greatly appreciated. And so, like at first, this woman is just like, okay, well, like if anything, you can use my radio. And so, once they end up going into this house, they realize that this woman is to all of a sudden be tied to this hermit guy, and they're like, oh my god, like we want nothing to do with this woman, and let's just get the heck out of here, because maybe they're just kind of concerned about whatever they're gonna let slip, or like eventually they're just worried that eventually something's going to happen to them if they accidentally reveal any number of things. So they just head the heck out of there to eventually find some other place to eventually try and get some kind of help. So, but yeah, so Paul talked to the Winston guy to eventually get a tow truck, and eventually this Winston character eventually completely forgets all about it and never really sends a tow truck out there, because Winston is to eventually later on in the movie just say it's like, well, hey man, like I did send a tow truck out there, but all of a sudden like the tow truck had problems, and so I had to go and get a tow truck to get this tow truck. And like it just feels like this guy is to have just basically completely like lied about all this whole story. But anyways, uh so eventually let's all have these characters end up coming back for whatever reason. So we now have to be kind of worried about who is all going to eventually drink the water here. And so when both Bert and Jeff were going to make a bet with one another that eventually they were going to drink beer this whole time instead of drinking anything else, because Eli Roth's character was to make this thing about like him smoking weed and then drinking, or somebody smoking weed and then drinking beer the whole time, and it messed him up for like 5 days. So the two guys, both Jeff and Bert, were making a bet together whether like how long they could kind of just drink beer and nothing else. So they are to supposedly be the characters that we're just kind of hoping are going to last the longest here. So the first one who is to go down is to be Karen. Paul ends up giving Karen something of water, and she ends up drinking it. And then I'm like, oh no. Weirdly enough, there was something weirdly in that water. Like, I don't know what kind of leaf or something like that was actually in that water, but there was something in that water. It's so weird. So Karen ends up drinking this water, and so eventually Paul is to just kind of consistently try to win over Karen, because before he ends up handing her this water, they end up going into the lake together. And so Karen is to mention this story about her and this one boy, that it seemed like they knew one another for such a long time that this boy ended up kissing her. And eventually Karen is to say that because it's all leading up to Karen just saying it's like, well, you know, somebody that you've met for such a long time, and you just finally just want to like just say like how you really feel about that person, or just kind of prove that you actually do like this person. And so all of a sudden Karen is to kiss Paul, and then Karen all of a sudden is to go and jump into the lake. And so Paul is like, well, like what does this mean now? Like, are we dating? Like like is this our first date? Like what is this exactly? And Karen is like let's not put labels on something. Because more than likely that probably just means that they're probably not, like they're probably just gonna have fun at this cabin, but that's all they're ever really gonna do probably. So we have Paul who ends up giving Karen this water, and so Karen is to eventually go and sleep in this bed, and so Paul is to eventually kind of like ask Karen something while she's in this bed. And so Karen is just like, well, hey, how about you just kind of like sleep with me in this bed, just kind of comfort me. And Paul's like, okay, sure. And so kind of in the middle of the night, Paul just decides to eventually just kind of uh, eventually play around with Karen a little bit. Eventually take some fingers and put them down below, if you know what I'm saying. So all of a sudden or all of a sudden Paul is going and touching Karen to all of a sudden then realize that like things kind of feel a little bit weird. So Paul all of a sudden kind of like resends back his hands to find out that his hands are yeah, his hands are a little red, let's just say. And so all of a sudden Paul is now like, oh my god. So he runs off to eventually quickly wash his hands. And so now we end up finding out that Karen seems to have like some skin irritation going down right by her panty line. And I'm like, oh no, Karen. Like I saw the remake, and I'm immediately like, yeah, I guess she's gonna be the one girl that's gonna eventually end up being forced uh, into that like shed like thing, and I'm like, oh my god, that's so awful, and I just feel so bad for her. Um, but yeah, like plus that like the whole scene where like her friends are trying to be nice, but they're also not going to all seemingly go out of their way to like quickly try and find a cure for this girl either. It just feels like they only care about themselves and that's it. Like I would have just kept since this girl like that's basically this girl's room is like I wouldn't touch anything in this room after this girl's being there. I would have just kept this girl in this room and just been like, okay, like just stay in this room and don't go anywhere else. Plus, also, where they kind of put this girl, I'm like, where could she have even have gone to the bathroom? Because it doesn't really seem like there is a actual bathroom here. Um, I don't know. I was just kind of concerned about this girl's just kind of health and well being. Because I'm a gentleman. Anyways, pushing on. So what ends up happening is these people are concerned about their own well-being. But here's the thing. They end up going and consistently touching Karen and eventually picking her up and kind of placing her in certain locations. And I am just like, we have Bert who is to mention to the other people, it's like, dude, you keep picking her up and touching her, like you're gonna get sick just like she is. And I'm like, yeah, that's what I was thinking also, but like they're trying to be nice people, and if anything, if they end up getting like sick after this, it's like, well, like she gave it to me, and like I was trying to be the nice person and whatever, and we just have Marcy that is trying so like much to try to be like try to be nice to Karen, bring her food and stuff like that, and so that's really nice. And they end up consistently telling her that there is supposedly always going to be someone out there to help or talk to Karen, but that doesn't seem all honestly that true. So, because eventually people continue to go off and just wander on their own to eventually try and find somebody that they can call, like a radio or something, to eventually try and get help. So eventually, Paul wanders off again to eventually find this one home to try and get help for Karen. And so Paul is to eventually stumble upon this one home where all of a sudden we see this woman where we basically see the whole back side of her because she's not wearing anything, and it seems uh, like her pillow or bed sheets are just kind of covering up certain kind of parts. And so all of a sudden this woman's husband is to all of a sudden be poking outside this house to all of a sudden notice Paul. And so this guy's like, hey, what the heck are you doing? Like, that's my wife in there. And so all of a sudden Paul is like, oh my god, I just wanted to just see if you guys had a radio. And so like this guy was just like, I'm sorry, but like you wanted to see a little bit more than that. So like I don't know, like Paul just like sadly enough, like I remember him from like Boy Meets World and all kinds of like interesting stuff. But like Paul really comes off as like a peeper in this movie. It's really bad. But I guess it's just coincidence or whatever. But anyways, so and if you have like a beautiful woman and like you just can't stop staring and whatever, uh so Paul just has to forcibly head back. So Marcy is to eventually try and talk to Karen. And so Karen is to just kind of mention to Marcy, it's like, well, I wouldn't want to get you guys infected now, would I? She like she's lighting a cigarette and she's kind of like puffing it away because she's just kind of ticked at this point. Why wouldn't she? She's basically realizing that her life is probably going to be in the hands of other people. Plus, also like she knows that she's probably going to die. So so now we eventually have to go into who eventually ends up getting sick next. Uh, and not only do we have to deal with that, but then we also have to deal with like these random dogs that are to eventually try and break into Karen's little shed thing. And so we have to deal with that also. So, but anyways, pushing on. So eventually we just get to where the characters eventually figure out a way to try and fix this car to where they end up getting the car started. And so eventually they decide like, hey, we have to figure out where we can have Karen being put in this car. Is she going to be put into the uh, like the just packed part of this truck? Is she gonna be put in one of these seats? Like, where is she gonna be put? Because we're gonna take her, and like we're gonna take her to eventually get some help. So Karen ends up going into the front seat, and then we immediately have Karen who ends up just spitting out blood all over the windshield. And so they're just like, well, I guess we can't move her anywhere else besides this one front seat. And so eventually, Karen is to be put out of the car, and Bert just ends up driving off on his own because he's just like, you know what, F it, like, I want to get out of here. Because Bert ends up finding out that he is to seemingly be infected next because he ends up going into the house and he ends up drinking this thing of water. And so Paulus mentioned to Bert that that he lost the bet because Bert ended up drinking this water. And so then immediately having Bert start to get this infection. All of a sudden he's like scratching onto the back of his neck to find out that there's blood on his hands. And so Bert ends up just starting to just eventually head back to the convenience store where eventually he re-meets back up with that kid who bites people. And so weirdly, we end up having this kid who's doing these weird, bizarre, like karate moves, and then he goes and bites Bert on the hand. And so now the one kid's father is just to be like mad at Bert and basically mentioning like, "Hey man, like if you're infected with something and my kid just bit you, like you just killed my kid." That's murder. You're gonna go to prison forever. And Bert is just so. We can just tell that Bert is just so like stressed out at this point and so panicky and whatever. In hearing about like this guy telling him that he's gonna go and shoot him down, because eventually that's what happens. Where all these people at its convenience store, who are all these like hillbilly-esque like characters, start running after Bert and trying to shoot him down because he's infected. And so Bert ends up running back to the cabin eventually. So what ends up happening with all the other characters? So Jeff ends up going and taking all the cases of beer and he ends up running off because basically he wants nothing to do with this rest of the group because he's realizing that eventually all the rest of the people are eventually going to get infected. Even his girlfriend, who is to be Marcy, Jeff is like, dude, I don't want anything to do with any of you people because I know that eventually one of you is going to get infected. Like, Darcy is to eventually mention that they like should all just try to prepare their own food and go and do their own thing because eventually that'll limitate who ends up getting actually infected. So eventually Jeff just goes off with a thing of beer to eventually go off into this cave and just to F off because he's like, dude, I'm not like I'm not going to deal with anybody. So uh, so eventually Paul and Darcy just makes this moment where she's like, you know what, like I feel like I'm probably gonna die right now, so if anything, let's just bang it out, Darcy and Paul. So uh eventually, like both Darcy and Paul are just going at it, and eventually Paul is to go and pour Listerine on his junk, and eventually Darcy is going to go into this tub and start shaving her legs, where eventually she's going to be shaving her legs a little bit close to the actual skin. Man, like I of course knew that this scene was happening, but I was still just like, oh my god, just like women who end up like shaving their legs and whatever, like shaving their whole body and all that kind of stuff, when eventually they of course like want to just have the smoothest shave, for their whole body. I'm just like, man. But we end up getting this scene where like skin is coming off when this girl's to shave. So gross. So she ends up just eventually just kind of like going and taking a shower, and when she's to start to shower, all of a sudden like her skin is to just more and more come off. So this girl goes outside and is now just wearing a robe, and so all of a sudden this dog chases after Marcy and just starts uh just tearing her up to where eventually Darcy just dies, I'm assuming from blood loss. So Paul is to eventually go and I think at some point eventually end up trying to call for Jeff to let him know to eventually not try to drink any of the water, because eventually Paul goes off to uh, eventually find where the whole sink water is coming from, and he ends up finding this lake where he ends up finding this dead body, and so he realizes it's the diseased homeless man. And so coincidentally, Paul ends up falling right into this lake where this homeless guy is, like basically right on top of his body. And then so Paul ends up going and is to try and grab onto this ladder to get out of this water, and the ladder continues to break. And so luckily Paul ends up getting out of the water, but we're like, well, if he wasn't diseased before, he is now. And so eventually Paul heads back to the campsite, where of course we end up finding out seemingly that Marcy's dead. Uh, Eventually Karen was eventually left to just be in the middle of this forest somewhere, because they couldn't figure out where to actually put her. But they eventually, I think, end up putting her back into uh, the little shed thing to eventually find out that this dog had chewed her up. And so Paul ended up killing Karen if she wasn't dead already, to just kind of uh, like just kind of as a mercy killing, just kill her off, because to just kind of like not have her die in pain. So eventually Paul is to re-meet up with Bert, who Bert is making his way back to the cabin after these hillbillies are kind of after him. So all of a sudden the hillbillies make it back to this cabin. Eventually they open the door to have Bert shoot one of them, and then eventually Paul is to go off and figure out a way to kill two of the other hillbilly characters, and eventually leave one in this kind of basement, uh, where is to kind of have evidence that, like, hey, this disease was already there before these kids got there. So so eventually what ends up happening is evidently there is to have had the police officers realize that there is this disease going on, and because eventually the convenience store is to call the police and let them know about this. So eventually Paul is to go off on his own to eventually just figure out how to find people And so eventually he ends up finding these people having this party, and he bumps right back into Winston. And so Paul is like, hey, where were you? Like, where were you? What were you doing? Like, hey, I needed your help and you weren't there. And Winston is like, oh man, I'm sorry, I completely forgot. Tow truck after tow truck, and I couldn't figure out how to help you. But hey man, do you need a ride? As you're slathered in blood, do you need some help? So all of a sudden, Winston is getting a call over the radio mentioning about these diseased, these skin diseased people, and that eventually they have to get shot on sight. And so now that Winston is hearing this, like Paul's immediately thinking, like, dude, is this guy gonna seriously try to get to me? And so Paul ends up smacking Winston over the head, and eventually this all starts a chain reaction of eventually Paul going and I think falling on one person who ends up getting kind of like blood in their face. So eventually it starts a chain reaction where everybody just starts running off or getting in their cars and driving the heck out of here. And hopefully they won't spread this whole disease. So what eventually ends up happening is they end up finding Paul and they end up uh, bringing him into this hospital. And so, like, all the sheriffs and all of everybody are there and they're asking him questions about how exactly this all happened and how this all started. And so Paul starts to answer their questions. Um, but he's also just kind of checking himself about how much further that this like seemingly skin disease is spreading. So we now go back to covering Jeff. So Jeff, who would spend his time drinking beers out in the cave or forest or whichever somewhere, and so he ends up going back into the cabin, just seeing the cabin just filled like with walls and everywhere with just blood and just so much blood everywhere. He goes into every single room. Every single room is just covered in blood. So Jeff is just to realize that he's like, oh my god, like I beat this, I won, like I didn't get diseased, huzzah, huzzah for me. And so Jeff is to feel great because he is to have thought that he won, and he like is to eventually be unscathed by this whole thing because he didn't drink the water and whatever this thing was, he eventually just completely avoided it. He has this like napkin or whatever over his face, or this handkerchief over his face, so he thinks that he has won this whole thing. So Jeff starts to walk from out of this cabin to eventually get riddled by bullets by these police officers who are to now go and take every one of these bodies that were in this cabin, and they end up shooting the guy in the basement and putting a match to this cabin, and they end up hauling out any number of any of these bodies and put them ablaze and put them in flames, of course, to make sure that they killed everything off. But eventually, I'm sure there's something that's going to slip into the cracks and continue to spread this whole illness. But yeah, so with that said, I think that ends up covering most of this film. I like there was something about me that did like this film, but again, there's also some like cringy moments and paranoid moments where eventually that also is just kind of like, ugh. But like, I like the fact that this movie is to make me uncomfortable like that. I like the fact that this movie is to just kind of be this kind of gruesome, gory, fun film where eventually at some points we get to see some either topless women or some sex moments. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.